So the visual dimension is present in all forms of artistic expression. In the case of music, the visual aspect manifests itself in various ways, one of them being in the form of cover arts. The music market has undergone substantial transformations since the invention of the long play or LP. The LP packaging, which has a practical function of protecting the physical media, allowed the creation and development of album covers, which is clearly different from book covers because images represent and interact with another medium. And album covers have become indispensable even in contexts where packaging became dispensable, as in the case of digital albums. But I'll come back to it in a moment. So since we'll be dealing with album covers in classical music, I have to go back in time a bit. So before the development of audio recording technologies, the standard form of preservation and dissemination of a musical piece was through sheet music. According to Donald Crummell, in England, the annual output established after the 1700s was of several hundred editions a year. And it appears to have persisted throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. And a cover was often added to it. This opened up a whole new market for designers and engravers who were commissioned to illustrate music sheet covers. British music publishers remained largely committed to the process of engraving, and thus they tended to maintain their identity apart from the publishers of religious service books and song anthologies. And in my view, the illustrated sheet music covers are the blueprint to the album covers that emerged in the late 1930s. So on the next slide, you see that, the next slide, please. Therefore, if we can agree that sheet music is the ancestor of the pre-recorded album, we could go a bit further and say that William Blake is the forefather of Peter Blake, the genius behind covers such as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. And I'm saying this because when our Blake was about 29 years old in 1786, he designed and engraved a cover leaf for a music sheet, as you can see on the slide. The elegy was a poem by Anne Hammer Hunter, set to music by the organist and composer Thomas Cummins. The engraving depicts a returning sailor welcomed by his wife and child. On the right, you can see the zoomed-in image in which you can easily recognize Blake's style, right? On the next slide, you see that, interestingly enough, some 3 years before this commission, in 1783, Blake engraved several plates for Joseph Rickson's book, A Select Collection of English Songs. On the next slide, please, you see that Songs of Innocence first came out in 1789, not long after all these commissions. So we could speculate that the very fact that he designed and illustrated music-related works must have played a role in his urge and desire to create his own songbook or his proto-musical album. Well, I bet many of you are aware of the fact that some of Blake's songs, according to John Thomas Smith, were noted down by music professors, and that Blake had actually a quite nice voice. So I wonder, had technology permitted at the time, would he have recorded his songs like singer-songwriters do? Would he have made a kind of concept double album out of his songs of innocence and experience? Would the cover have looked like the title page we know? I'd like to hear thoughts on that at the end. Anyway, moving forward to early 20th century, when phonograph records were invented, a whole new and very lucrative music market developed and changed completely the way we perceive and consume music. The packaging of such new physical object initially functioned exclusively as protection, and actually, the early discs were even shipped and sold sleeveless. As Johns informs us, only in 1910, sleeves had become an industry-wide standard, and they were available in two basic types, as you can see on the next slide. The first was made of packing paper and imprinted with the manufacturer's trademark. The second was blank with a hole cut out in the center to display the label of the record itself. In the 1930s and 1940s, record companies realized that a 12-inch square of the sleeves could be made more visually attractive to boost sales. RCA started a movement of using paintings from canonic artists on the cover of classical music albums, matching the cover designs to the music according to the historical period, even though those correspondences, as we shall see, become looser and looser. On the next slide, you see the earliest example of a Blake design on an album cover I was able to find. And this is a record of his romantic contemporary Ludwig van Beethoven, containing the very famous Ninth Symphony. It was released by the Gramophone Limited in 1955 with one of Blake's most iconic illustrations, The Ancient of Days. As far as I'm concerned, Beethoven never set a Blake text to music, and actually, the text sung in the very famous fourth movement, Ode to Joy, was an adaptation of a poem by Schiller. But an acceptable explanation for this choice of a Blake illustration has to do with that criterion set by the classical labels, which is to match the cover art and the composer's period. And as you can see on the next slide, Blake is the choice for a couple of other Beethoven records that followed by different labels, and we find The Ancient of Days again in a record released in 1998. And since we are talking about The Ancient of Days, there's an even more conspicuous relationship between that image and a specific musical composition. So the next slide, please. Joseph Haydn was also a contemporary of Blake, although he's considered a composer of the classical period, not romantic. His oratorio, The Creation, or Die Schöpfung in German, was composed in the 1790s, around the same time as The Ancient of Days. And this is considered one of Haydn's masterpieces. The most obvious explanation for their choice is that the text of Haydn's oratorio depicts and celebrates the creation of the world as narrated in the book of Genesis. And Blake's images clearly related to the theme of the creation of the world. And the compass is a powerful symbol that reinforces that creative act. Next slide, please. The second most popular image by Blake to illustrate Haydn's oratorio is God Create Adam. So this illustration focuses on the creation of man in contrast with the creation of the world as a whole, as suggested by the Ancient of Days. And since Haydn's composition refers to the creation in a broader sense, the Ancient of Days seems to fit the bill better. But what really struck me was that Blake is also the choice for many other works by Haydn, as you can see on the next slide. All the albums on this slide were released by the same label, which explains the similar layout and, of course, the standard choice for Blake on the cover. A producer of the label might have perceived a strong connection between Haydn and Blake. If you pay attention to the titles, you see that all compositions have a religious connotation. They are all masses: the Creation Mass, the Maria Theresa Mass, the Harmony Mass, and so on and so on. And this collection of album covers again confirms how powerful Blake's religious iconography has become in the last decades. All these images by Blake are inspired by the Bible. We have God creating Adam, Satan in his original glory, Christ in the sepulchre, guarded by angels, the great red dragon, and the woman clothed in the sun. An angel cast Satan into the bottomless pit and shut him up. Death on a pale horse. The Ancient of Days again. David delivered out of many waters. They all inspired by specific biblical passages. And we have another notorious example of strong association between a composer and Blake. On the next slide, you see some covers of Mahler records, in which 3 of them are illustrated again with the Ancient of Days. The one on the bottom left is the inscription of a hell gate, and the other 2 are the Simoniac Pope from Blake's illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy. Mahler comes after Beethoven, but he's still considered a romantic composer. His style is often described as dark and tragic, with his unending rumination on mortality, and there is nothing gloomier and darker than the Bible, right? So now next slide, you see that similarly to what happened to Haydn, a label decided on a standardized Mahler series with Blake illustrations on the cover. The Russian label Melodia combined the Art Nouveau aesthetics, as we can see in the font style, with Blake, which actually go well together. I mean, like Blake pastels, color palette, and fluid shapes. By the way, there is a very, very interesting article by Robert Schmutzler, William Blake, and Art Nouveau, which I highly recommend. In terms of the images selected for this collection, they all from Blake's illustrations of Dante's Divine Comedy. Blake also illustrates the cover of other illustrious composers. We have on the next slide 3 Johann Sebastian Bach records with illustrations by Blake. And similar to Haydn, all the 3 albums consist of religious music, the motets and 2 masses. And the 2 of them use the same illustration, Christ in the Sepulchre guarded by angels, and the other one is titled The Angel Rolling the Stone Away from the Sepulchre, both produced at around the same time by Blake. On the next slide, we see other albums by canonic composers with illustrations by Blake. Sibelius, Berlioz, Mendelssohn, Strauss, Rossini, Schubert, Rachmaninoff. They are either romantic or later romantics, fitting that old criterion. But we couldn't say Mozart and Karloff are. However, it's not difficult to see the relationship between the cover art and the content. To my mind, the illustration, Christ in the Sepulchre guarded by angels, found on Mozart's cover, matches perfectly with a piece titled Requiem, which is by definition a piece of music at which people honor and pray for a dead person. In Karloff's case, the watercolor The Great Red Dragon and the woman clothed with the sun evokes the highly symbolic passages of the Book of Revelation, and Karloff's trilogy of cantatas, Triumphi, which includes his most famous piece, Carmina Burana, is suffused with Christian and mystical symbolism. I don't know about you, but if it was up to me to choose the soundtrack for The Last Judgment, Carmina Burana would certainly be my choice. The apocalyptic atmosphere set by Karloff's composition seemed to match the ominous aura of the image quite well. Now we are moving towards the composers who actually set Blake text to, and even images to music. It's the case of Vaughan Williams, who famously set 10 poems for Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, and also wrote the ballet Job, A Mask for Dancing, for the centennial of the death of William Blake in 1927, based on Blake's illustrations for the Book of Job. Interestingly, the image chosen for the cover of the album, which contains the settings of Songs of Innocence and Experience, is from the Book of Thel, plate 6 precisely. And I'm not quite sure what motivated that choice, but it's quite similar to but that image is quite similar to other images found in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. So maybe they thought it was interchangeable. The next slide shows how diversified are the album covers for Vaughan's Job, A Mask for Dancing. Choices include engravings and watercolors of Blake's illustrations for the Book of Job. The next slide contains 2 John Tavener's records. Tavener is a 20th century English composer, particularly known for his extensive output of choral religious works. He only set the poems The Lamb, the Tiger, and A Creator's Song from Songs of Innocence and Experience. However, none of Tavener's covers features a design from that book. Instead, we have the painting titled Our Lady with the Infant Jesus riding on a lamb with St. John's and the Vision of the Last Judgment. Even though the first cover is not a design from Songs of Innocence and Experience, it features a lamb. So there is a more direct correspondence to Blake's songs than the second one. But since Tavener's compositions are essentially religious, Blake's biblical imagery fits in quite well, and we should also bear in mind that in neither cases we're dealing with a whole album dedicated to Blake, let alone to the songs. So you see in a minute what happens to albums entirely dedicated to the songs. So Benjamin Britten, on the next slide, is another English composer who set Blake to music. In 1965, he premiered his Songs and Proverbs of William Blake, which was first released as an album in 1969, along with John Donne's sonnets. And the collage with the portraits of Donne and Blake surrounded by a peacock, a tiger, framed by an apple seems so wrong to me. And the next release was the illustration titled Job's Evil Dreams, followed by 2 other releases with images taken from Songs of Innocence and Experience. Therefore, there's a more obvious and direct correspondence to the content in the last two. And since we're still talking about songs of innocence and experience, on the next slide, there are examples of covers for the settings of that particular work by contemporary classical composers, in which three of them, the ones above, use plates and fragments of plates from the songs, while the other three below use different works. On Lucien Postman's cover, we have the illustration The River of Life. On Gary Hingson's cover, we find Blake's illustration for A Midsummer Night's Dream. And on Frank Levin's The Great Red Dragon and a Woman Clothed with a Sun. Lucien Postman's and Gary Hingson's covers can be read as representations of innocence, whereas Levin's image suggests a tension between good and evil, the contrary states of innocence and experience. So we see that the images mirror and interact with the musical content in a way or another, in the sense that the use of the plates of the work set to music are not necessarily the only means to convey a certain idea or intention of the musical content. The next slide contains a number of literary works illustrated by Blake, which were set to music by various composers. Pictures 1, 2, 3, and 4, we see John Milton's works, Comus, L'Allegri, Penseroso, Paradise Lost, and On the Morning of Christ's Nativity. On picture 5, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. On picture 6, The Pilgrim Progress by John Bunyan, and picture 7, Nine Thoughts by Edward Young. All these covers testify the high status of Blake, not just as a visual artist, but more specifically as an illustrator of other literary works, and reflects the recognition of Blake's deep understanding of other writers and his competence to represent the essence of a literary work without deviating from his own vision. Well, and to conclude, I would like to quickly show a couple of classical album covers that were released digitally only. On the next slide. In the digital landscape, the role of album art has changed with the rise of streaming platforms and digital downloads. While physical album sales have declined, the importance of eye-catching digital artwork has increased. Artists now have to consider how the album covers will appear as small thumbnails on screens, ensuring that the visual impact remains strong even in a reduced size. This shift has led to new design trends and considerations in creating album art that is not only visually appealing, but also optimized for digital platforms. But there's another issue here. Since the whole structure provided by a record company is no longer a given, so many composers and musicians are now independent, and very often the artists themselves are the cover designers without necessarily mastering the craft, as we can see on picture 4. And since the basic album information is usually provided by the music platform and the size of the covers online are very small, there is a tendency that albums released digitally only don't have words on the cover, which is the case of covers 1 and 3. And amongst all the 4 covers, my personal favorite is cover 2 because of the artistry involved. On the next slide, you can see in more detail. It's a quite nice drawing inspired by the last plate of Songs of Innocence. And if you look carefully, you see that the cover even imitates the texture of paper. So I'm aware I'm running out of time, and there are so many other points I'd like to present today. So many covers were left out and so many questions to think about, but I was very pleased to confirm that Blake's influence and reception in music is manifold. I would like to further explore, for instance, to what extent Blake's religious iconography has not replaced, but revitalized Italians' iconic representations of God, of Satan, of angels, prophets, biblical characters, as we have seen in so many album covers from the composers of sacred music today. Well, I'll shut up now, and thank you very much for listening.